From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, be sure you go over to the Follow Button's house and rile up their brand new puppy right before bedtime. This episode is called Family Ties. Dr. Bill Linder groaned as he dragged a suitcase up the stairs of his house in Columbus, Ohio. It was June of 1990, and the 43-year-old doctor had just returned from a family trip to Israel with his 2 teenage daughters. The vacation had gone smoothly until one of their relatives got seriously ill. Bill's wife stayed behind to care for their family member, while Bill and the kids returned back home. As he struggled to get his heavy luggage up each step, Bill could hear his daughters, 15-year-old Jocelyn and 16-year-old Hillary, running down to the basement to watch a movie. He couldn't believe they could keep their eyes open. After a 2-week trip, an international flight, and a long drive home from the airport, he felt exhausted. When he finally reached the upper landing, Bill headed straight to his room and collapsed into bed. But as soon as he took off his socks, he noticed his ankles looked swollen. Bill wondered if he'd accidentally injured his ankles by walking too much on vacation, but when he felt around the joints for sore spots, they didn't hurt. So Bill figured the swelling must be a result of too much sitting during the long international flight. Bill stood up and walked into his bathroom and grabbed a bottle of diuretic pills out of his medicine cabinet. He took one, hoping it might reduce the fluid buildup in his body. Then Bill crawled back into bed, desperate for a nap. Less than an hour later, Bill woke up. He still felt tired, but it was getting close to dinner time, and he knew his daughters needed to eat. So he threw the covers back and got out of bed. Bill walked out of his bedroom, intending to walk down to the kitchen, but as he stood at the top of the stairs, he started to feel lightheaded. His vision went blurry and his ears began to ring. He reached out to grab the stair railing for support, but he missed, and instead of catching himself, he fell face first into the metal rail. For a moment, everything went black. Then Bill heard Jocelyn and Hillary running up the stairs, followed by their frantic voices asking if he was okay. Bill slowly opened his eyes. He realized he was lying at the top of the stairs, and he felt this warm, wet liquid dripping down his temple. He touched the side of his head, and when he looked at his fingers, he saw they were covered in blood. He turned to his side and saw both of his daughters staring at him, their eyes wide with terror. Bill slowly stood up, holding onto the railing this time, and promised Jocelyn and Hillary that he was okay. His head was just throbbing from hitting the railing, but other than that, he felt okay. He said he must have just gotten up too fast. The girls insisted on taking Bill to see one of the doctors at his family practice. Bill didn't want to leave the house, but he figured if a quick checkup would put his daughters' minds at ease, then it was worth it. When they got to the family clinic a few minutes later, Bill could tell his colleagues were shocked to see him with dried blood caked onto his cheek. Luckily, the visit was short. The physician on duty cleaned Bill up, gave him 7 stitches, and then just sent him home. 2 years later, in the summer of 1992, Bill and his favorite nurse, whose name was Kim, were closing up the family clinic for the day. Bill had not had any more health scares since his fall 2 years earlier, so in that time he'd just been focusing on spending time with his family and continuing to expand his medical practice. Though it was getting close to dinner time, Bill did not need to rush home. His wife Rhoda was out of town, and the girls were going out with their friends. So he and Kim took their time wiping down countertops and restocking the exam rooms, chatting and drinking a couple of beers that Bill had stashed in the office refrigerator. Bill and Kim finally headed out to the parking lot at about 7 p.m. And as the two of them walked across the concrete, Bill suddenly started to feel short of breath. He'd only gone a few dozen yards, but he felt like he'd just sprinted a mile. He stood still and tried to stop panting, but inhaling just kept getting harder and harder. Kim put her hand on his shoulder and gave him a very concerned look. Bill turned to her and just said, "I need to go to the hospital." Kim sped Bill to the nearest emergency room, and when they got there, Kim helped Bill shuffle up to the front desk. In between labored breaths, he told the receptionist that he could barely breathe, but since he was a doctor, he knew what he needed. He asked to have a chest x-ray as soon as possible. Less than an hour later, Bill was lying on a hard bed in a hospital room, still struggling to inhale while Kim coached him through each breath. Finally, a radiologist entered the room with the x-ray results, and Kim helped Bill sit up so he could see. But what Bill saw on the X-ray film seemed impossible. Normally, lungs appear dark on an X-ray, but Bill's looked white. Now, Bill was not a lung specialist, but he'd known since medical school that this was a sign of fluid building up around the lungs. In severe cases, there can be so much liquid in the chest cavity, the lungs can't inflate properly, making it difficult or even impossible to breathe. Looking at the X-ray, Bill felt genuinely frightened. Now he understood why he was so short of breath, but what he didn't understand was why all this fluid was building up in the first place. It usually only occurred in patients who were elderly or extremely sick with things like pneumonia or cancer. Bill was 45 years old and careful about his health. He watched what he ate, exercised every day. He had no chronic illnesses, and so this just didn't make sense. Bill asked the radiologist what could be causing this, and the young woman said she didn't know. They would need to run tests to find the source of the fluid. Right now, the best thing they could do was just drain the liquid out of his chest cavity using a procedure called tapping. Bill dreaded the sound of that word. He knew exactly what tapping was, but he had never thought he'd have to experience it himself. It was a crude, unpleasant procedure, and the worst part was, Bill would be wide awake for the entire thing. Half an hour later, Bill was sitting shirtless on the edge of his hospital bed while the attending physician sat on a stool beside him. She disinfected Bill's back, then injected a local anesthetic near the rear of his rib cage. Bill's back quickly went numb, but that did not make him feel any less afraid, and so he reached out for Kim, who was still there to support him. Bill wanted to close his eyes for the next part, but he was too terrified to look away. He watched as the physician brought a long, thick needle towards his back. Then he felt a dull pressure as she plunged this needle between his ribs and pushed it deep into the space surrounding his lungs. Then the attending physician attached the opposite end of this needle to a thin tube, which led to a clear plastic container. As Bill squeezed Kim's hand and tried to relax, liquid began to drain out of his chest. Bill hoped the liquid would be clear or tan, because those were the most common colors of fluid in the chest cavity, and he didn't want to see any red tint, which could mean he was bleeding internally. But the fluid Bill saw coming out of his back and going up this tube was not clear, tan, or red. It was a thick, milky, yellowy substance that reminded him of the filling inside of a lemon meringue pie. He sat there watching this weird, gross liquid flow through the tube until an entire liter had been drained from the area surrounding his lungs. Finally, Bill felt a dull ache as the attending physician removed the needle and then covered the puncture hole with a bandage. Bill released his grip on Kim's hand and then asked the attending physician, what just came out of my body? What was that? She told him that the thick, milky fluid he was seeing was known as chyle, which is a mixture that includes fluids from the body's immune system. When a person has an infection, these fluids will flood the infected area, but they normally disappear after the infection is gone. The doctor told Bill that his body was not draining these fluids correctly, and it was causing a fluid buildup known as lymphedema. Now that Bill thought about it, lymphedema could explain the swelling problems that he had been experiencing for years. He'd thought that his badly swollen ankles a couple of years ago were caused by the long flight home from Israel, but now he realized it could be from something much worse. Because it wasn't just swelling in his legs and ankles. His body was leaking fluids into the space around his lungs, which was really baffling. His doctor agreed that chyle should never leak into the body like this. She said she had only ever seen that happen in cases of liver failure, certain cancers, and in heart disease. When the doctor mentioned heart disease, Bill remembered something. As a child, he'd been diagnosed with a heart murmur, a tiny sound that indicated a serious problem with his heart. Bill had undergone open heart surgery to correct the murmur when he was just 12 years old. Since the operation, Bill had not had any cardiac problems, but now he wondered, could his childhood illness be connected to the symptoms he was experiencing as an adult? The physician said it was possible, but she also told him not to panic. They wouldn't be able to determine exactly what was happening until he underwent a series of tests. Until then, he should just stay calm and not jump to any conclusions. Bill promised he would try, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his heart could be failing him. Over a year later, in 1994, Bill held onto his wife's arms as she slowly lowered him into the bathtub inside their room at a Boston hotel where they had been staying for months. They were visiting the doctors who had treated Bill's heart as a child, plus many more specialists throughout the city. They were hoping to find someone who'd be able to make sense of Bill's bizarre symptoms. While Bill's wife, Rhoda, scrubbed his aching back with a sponge, Bill thought about all the tests he'd undergone. Multiple cardiologists had examined his heart, and they had all said the same thing, that it was functioning totally normally. So whatever was happening to him, it couldn't have anything to do with his heart or with the surgery he'd undergone as a child. There was also nothing wrong with his kidneys or his liver or his immune system. What's more, he didn't appear to have cancer. Based on the test results, Bill should have been perfectly healthy. But he wasn't. The space around his lungs continued to fill with chyle, making every breath a struggle. His back was scarred from repeated tapping procedures to drain the fluid. Bill looked down at his stomach, which had become round and hard as a rock. This was a relatively new symptom, but it bothered him the most. Doctors told him that his stomach, his gut, was also filling up with chyle, which was even more worrisome than what was happening with his lungs. There were other alarming developments too. When Bill ate, the protein and fat in his food was not being processed correctly. Instead, it was leaking out of his intestines and mixing with his blood and other fluids. These were the ingredients in the chyle that kept building up inside of his body. As a doctor himself, Bill knew how serious this was. It meant that his body was not getting the nutrients it needed. With his wife's help, Bill climbed out of the bath, put on his pajamas, and got into bed. He closed his eyes, feeling absolutely miserable, and did his best to sleep. A few hours later, Bill woke up shivering and covered in sweat. He knew he must have a fever, so he shook his wife's shoulder to wake her up. Rhoda took one look at him and said they needed to go to the hospital right now. Bill held onto his wife as she helped him hobble out to the car, and then before he knew it, they were already at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. Bill was too feverish and confused to check in, so he collapsed into a waiting room chair while his wife spoke with the receptionist. A few minutes later, a nurse brought Bill a wheelchair and wheeled him down the hall. By the time they made it to the examination room, Bill could barely speak and his vision was blurry. He was vaguely aware of a doctor coming in to examine him, and then he heard that doctor say that Bill would need to go to the intensive care unit. Bill turned his head to the side. Through the haze of his vision, he could see his wife anxiously holding her hands in front of her chest. He tried to wave to her as if to tell her everything is going to be okay, but he was too weak to even lift his hand. Early the next morning, one of Bill and Rhoda's daughters, Jocelyn, walked through the large glass doors of Brigham and Women's Hospital. Jocelyn was now 19 years old and a college student right here in the Boston area. She'd been up very late the night before, but the moment her mom called her and told her that her dad was in the hospital, she'd gotten out of bed early and driven straight here from her dorm room. Despite her exhaustion, Jocelyn's nerves had her all wound up. She couldn't stop thinking about her father's illness, and she constantly felt anxious. She'd been skipping classes lately and partying too much, doing her best to distract herself from her dad's problems. When Jocelyn walked inside of her father's room, she saw her dad lying on the hospital bed with tubes coming out of his arms, and it made her feel even worse. He looked old and frail. She gave him a gentle hug and then sat down on the couch next to her mom and her older sister. Jocelyn's mother explained to her that her father had contracted a staph infection, which is a dangerous type of bacterial infection in the blood. He had likely gotten it during one of his many tests or fluid draining procedures. Jocelyn sighed. Her dad was already so sick, and this felt like one more health problem to add to the list. It felt like they were all just kind of waiting around powerlessly, praying for something to change. Just then, Jocelyn heard the door to the room creak open, and in walked her great-aunt, whose name was Joni. Joni lived in New York, and so the family did not see her much. But Joni skipped past the usual greetings, and instead she walked right up to Bill's hospital bed and held out a dusty 3-ring binder. Joni said she knew what was wrong with Bill. She said that she had seen all of his symptoms before in her own husband, Bill's uncle. All the proof was right here in the binder she had brought. Jocelyn nearly jumped out of her seat. Maybe Joni really was carrying the breakthrough the family had been hoping for. Jocelyn assumed her father would be excited too, but he immediately waved Joni off. He told her that the two cases were not similar at all, and so he didn't want to hear anything else about his Uncle Nathan. Confused, Jocelyn pulled her great-aunt out of the room and into the hallway and asked to look at the binder. Jocelyn realized these were her great-uncle's medical records. Nathan had died over 30 years earlier in 1961, and these documents detailed the illness that killed him. Jocelyn's great-uncle Nathan had suffered from lymphedema, or swelling, in his ankles, just like Jocelyn's father. Doctors also reported heavy chyle buildup in Nathan's chest and abdomen that needed to be drained repeatedly from his body. He'd even been diagnosed with a heart murmur. To Jocelyn, it did all sound very similar to her father's condition. When Jocelyn looked back up at her great-aunt, Joni seemed kind of apologetic. She said her husband Nathan had died a very long and painful death, and so she assumed that Bill refused to believe he might have the same condition because he couldn't bear to imagine dying the same way. Jocelyn nodded somberly, but inside, she was thinking that this information could be the key to actually helping her father. She told her great-aunt they needed to show these records to her father's doctors right away. The same day that Bill was admitted to the ICU, Dr. Christine Seidman was eating lunch in her office at Brigham and Women's Hospital. As she ate a forkful of leftovers, another doctor came inside and placed a 3-ring binder on her desk. They said it had to do with an ICU patient named Dr. Bill Linder. Dr. Seidman swallowed her food and then tucked her short black hair behind her ears. She looked over the documents while her colleague briefed her on Bill's condition. They explained the striking similarities between Bill's symptoms and his uncle's. Dr. Seidman immediately knew this case was right up her alley. In addition to being a cardiologist, she was a geneticist. Dr. Seidman knew that if anyone could solve this mystery illness, it was her. She jumped up from her desk and headed to the ICU. A few months later, in early 1995, Jocelyn sat on an exam table in the Brigham and Women's Hospital as Dr. Seidman rubbed cold gel across her skin and then pressed an ultrasound scanner against Jocelyn's chest. Dr. Seidman was performing something called an echocardiogram, or an ultrasound scan of Jocelyn's heart. The pressure of the plastic scanner hurt, but Jocelyn was too anxious about what the scan might reveal to worry about the pain. Ever since Dr. Seidman began looking into Bill's illness, she had been working closely with Jocelyn and the rest of the Linder family. Her goal was obviously to cure Bill, but to do that, she first had to identify his condition. She'd interviewed the Linder family and collected medical records going back generations, and she'd kept Jocelyn up to date on all her research, which was why Jocelyn knew how important this scan was. Dr. Seidman found that Jocelyn's father and great-uncle were not the only ones who suffered from this mystery illness. Jocelyn's great-grandmother, May, had had it too. The disease appeared to be hereditary, which meant it was getting passed down generation to generation. When Dr. Seidman had called Jocelyn in for this appointment, she explained that all 3 of Jocelyn's relatives who had dealt with this mystery illness, so her dad, great-uncle, and great-grandmother, had the same symptom first: a heart murmur. The doctors who had been treating Bill until now thought his childhood heart condition was totally irrelevant. But Dr. Seidman had discovered that it was actually the telltale sign of the mystery family disease. Jocelyn watched Dr. Seidman stare intently at the ultrasound screen. Then the doctor turned to Jocelyn, and with a pained expression on her face, she said Jocelyn did have a heart murmur. It was not a guarantee that Jocelyn would eventually develop the family disease, but there was now a very strong chance that she could. Jocelyn imagined her own body filling up with all that chyle the way her father's was, and tears began to well up in her eyes as she watched the black and white image of her heart beating on the screen. Normally, a heartbeat was a sign of life, but to Jocelyn, her heartbeat looked like a death sentence. Almost a year later, near the end of 1995, Bill sat inside of a room at the Ohio Doctors Hospital in Columbus. His condition had only gotten worse, and because doctors in Boston had not been able to help him, he and his wife Rhoda decided to go back home to Columbus. However, even though they were now closer to their house, Bill rarely spent a night in his own bed. He was almost always in one hospital or another. That day, Bill was hooked up to an IV that pumped vitamins and minerals into his bloodstream. His mystery illness had been stealing proteins and fats from his digestive system for almost 3 years, and so he now had to have this injection of nutrients twice a day in order to get the nutrients he needed. Bill looked down at his scab-covered arms from all the needles, his swollen ankles, and his huge, rounded stomach. He was in the worst shape of his life, physically and mentally. Bill knew that Dr. Seidman was trying to identify his illness and find a cure, and he had held out hope that she would. But now, he was just worried about the rest of his family. Dr. Seidman had told Bill that a total of 13 people in his family were likely to develop this disease, including both of his daughters. Now, Bill didn't only have to deal with his own horrible and confusing illness, he also had to deal with the knowledge that he might have passed it on to both of his kids. Suddenly, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and a tall man with gray hair and a clean-shaven face entered. He introduced himself as Dr. Larry Lynn. Dr. Lynn sat down beside Bill's bed. He explained that he was a pulmonologist, or a lung expert, but more than that, he was obsessed with medical mysteries. He told Bill that he spent his free time digging through the hospital's records for inexplicable cases, and he'd happened upon Bill's file. Bill was skeptical. He asked Dr. Lynn how many medical mysteries he'd been able to actually solve so far, and with a smirk, Dr. Lynn replied, "Every single one." For the first time in months, Bill smiled. About 3 months later, in the spring of 1996, Bill, along with his wife Rhoda and his daughters Jocelyn and Hillary, were all clustered together on the couch in Bill's room at the Ohio Doctors Hospital. Bill looked out his window at the Columbus skyline, and he inhaled deeply. He was breathing better than he had in years, and the scabs on his arms were finally beginning to heal. He felt healthy enough to get out of bed and sit with his family and carry on an actual conversation. Bill knew these improvements were all thanks to Dr. Lynn. When he began treating Bill, one of the first things Dr. Lynn suggested was a new diet. The chyle leaking into his abdomen contained fats and proteins, so Dr. Lynn told him he would need to eat a fat-free, low-protein diet. Dr. Lynn's hope was this would make his body produce less chyle. It had only taken a few weeks on this new diet for Bill to start to feel a difference. His gut was still hard and rounded, but he could now breathe better, and he also did not have to have the fluids drained from his chest as often. Bill breathed out and told his wife and children that soon enough he'd be healthy enough to go for a walk downtown. And as he dreamed about leaving the hospital for good, there was a knock at the door. Dr. Lynn came inside and told the family he had a big announcement. He had solved Bill's medical mystery. Bill and his family all sat up, anxious to hear what the doctor had to say. Dr. Lynn said he'd been investigating Bill's illness using a brand new tool called the Internet. He'd spent hours searching for people with symptoms similar to Bill's, and eventually he found a family in Turkey with a condition that seemed identical. They'd been diagnosed with a rare disorder called Behçet's disease. Behçet's disease causes blood vessels throughout the body to swell. This leads to bodily fluids like blood and lymph not being able to circulate properly, and one potential symptom is lymphedema, just like Bill and his relatives had experienced. Bill couldn't believe it. He asked the doctor what this diagnosis meant. Was his disease treatable? Would he and his daughters be okay? Dr. Lynn nodded. He said that while Behçet's disease was rare and poorly understood, the treatment couldn't be simpler. All Bill needed were steroid injections, and he'd be good as new. Bill jumped out of his hospital bed, an IV still attached to one arm. He threw his arms around his daughters, he kissed his wife over and over, and he let tears of joy roll down his cheeks. Finally, he was going to be okay again. The following night, Bill was lying in his hospital bed, looking at the dark sky through his window. Dr. Lynn had given him a steroid injection, and he felt hopeful that the treatment would work. But suddenly, Bill felt a sharp pain in his chest, and the whole room went black. 2 days later, Bill woke up. The light in his hospital room seemed blindingly bright. As his vision focused, he saw Dr. Lynn standing at the foot of his bed. The doctor's eyebrows were knitted together, and his lips were pressed into a frown. The doctor told Bill he'd gone into cardiac arrest. The hospital had been able to resuscitate him, but the emergency made one thing clear. Dr. Lynn had been wrong. Bill did not have Behçet's disease, and steroids were not going to cure him. If anything, they could have made his condition worse. Bill was stunned. He'd almost died, and now he was also back to square one with a mystery disease that no one knew how to treat that also might kill him. In that moment, he suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of absolute hopelessness. 6 months later, in September of 1996, Bill's daughter Jocelyn was writing on a yellow pad working on a term paper. After spending her early college years partying and skipping class, she was now committed to getting her life together and finishing her degree. Plus, focusing on school helped her ignore the things that made her the most anxious, the knowledge that she might one day develop the same disease that was killing her father. As she scrawled on her paper, Jocelyn's phone rang. She picked it up, and she heard her mother's strained voice on the other end. She said Jocelyn's father had been placed into a medically induced coma. Jocelyn's mother explained that doctors were no longer able to drain that chyle from her father's chest and abdomen. He just had way too much scar tissue built up from years of undergoing the tapping procedure. And so now the fluid buildup was putting immense pressure on his internal organs, and they were failing one by one. Jocelyn felt tears building in the corner of her eyes. She asked her mom if this meant her father was going to die. After a moment, her mother said yes. Jocelyn swallowed hard. Her father had never lost hope that his doctors would be able to identify his condition and find a cure, but they didn't. Jocelyn wanted to start sobbing, but she did know there was one hidden blessing. Her father's suffering would finally be over. And sure enough, just a few days later, on September 25th, Bill would die. Seven years later, in 2003, 28-year-old Jocelyn was walking towards the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, California. After her father passed away in September of 1996, Jocelyn had moved far away to California, but the trauma of her father's slow, painful decline followed her wherever she went. She was acutely aware that she might meet the same fate. It was also very hard for Jocelyn to forget that she had not been there during her father's last moments. She'd flown to Columbus and gone to the hospital, but when her dad actually drew his last breath, Jocelyn had been outside smoking a cigarette. Jocelyn had a lot of regrets and painful memories. The only thing that brought her any real solace were these long walks, when she could breathe in the summer air and organize her thoughts. Jocelyn found a nice spot to sit on the bridge where she could look through the red bars to the sparkling water down below. She crossed her legs, and as she did, she noticed that one of her ankles looked much larger than the other. It had swollen to nearly twice its normal size. Jocelyn remembered how her father's legs and ankles began to swell just a few years before he got really sick, but she tried not to panic. She told herself that her ankle was just aggravated from the long walk, and so she went back home that day, and sure enough, the swelling went down. But a few days later, she was at her apartment getting ready to go on another walk, and her foot and ankle were so swollen that she couldn't even get her shoe on. Jocelyn knew she could not ignore the swelling any longer, so she went to her small desk, turned on her computer, and opened up her email. She typed in Dr. Christine Seidman's address and wrote her a message asking if she should be worried about the swelling in her legs. Jocelyn finally got a response the next day. Dr. Seidman didn't say whether or not she should be worried. Instead, she offered to fly Jocelyn out to her lab near Boston. She said that in the 7 years since Jocelyn's father had passed away, she had not stopped researching her family's mystery illness, and she'd recently made a breakthrough that she wanted to tell Jocelyn about in person. The idea of going back to Boston made Jocelyn feel really nervous. She hadn't been there since her dad died. But this was very important, and so she responded to Dr. Seidman with a yes, and immediately began packing her bags. A few days later, Jocelyn walked into the tall red brick building that housed the Seidman Laboratory. She went inside and introduced herself to one of Dr. Seidman's research assistants, a young, dark-haired woman. As soon as Jocelyn said her name, the research assistant beamed. She told Jocelyn that she was so excited to see her. Jocelyn was really taken aback. She didn't even realize that the researchers would know who she was. Just then, Dr. Seidman rounded a corner and said hello, looking happier than Jocelyn had ever seen her before. Jocelyn followed her into the back of the lab, trailed by the cheerful assistant, and they all sat down in the cluttered room while Jocelyn looked back and forth at the two women, a little uneasy at how excited they both seemed. Before she could even ask what was going on, Dr. Seidman told her. She and her team had used a technology that had only just been developed, and at last, they had found the cause of her family's mysterious disease. Dr. Seidman had been painstakingly creating a map of Bill Linder's genes so that she could find anything that looked out of the ordinary. But there are hundreds of thousands of genes in every individual person, and Dr. Seidman had to build her map one by one. That's why her research had taken so long. But finally, they'd found an extremely rare mutation of a single gene that had caused Bill's illness. It was a lot like finding a needle in a haystack. The chances of a single defective gene leading to such a debilitating illness were about 1 in a billion. Even more surprisingly, Dr. Seidman concluded that no one in the world outside of the Linder family carried this mutation. Dr. Seidman discovered that the genetic mutation began with Jocelyn's great-great-grandmother, Esther, who first showed symptoms of the disease roughly 100 years earlier. That made Esther what disease trackers call patient zero, the first patient with a brand new disease. Since Esther, this mysterious condition had been passed down 5 generations. Once Dr. Seidman found this genetic defect, suddenly Bill's illness made more sense. The mutation stopped his liver from being able to properly filter toxins out of his blood, and from there, it caused a cascade of serious problems, including the chronic swelling and the chyle buildup in his chest and abdomen. Lastly, the genetic mutation also appeared to cause the family's telltale heart murmur. Jocelyn was on the edge of her seat as she heard all this. She asked Dr. Seidman if now they'd be able to cure her, her sister, and her other relatives who had likely inherited this disease. But Dr. Seidman shook her head sadly. She said, while this was a huge discovery, many questions still remained. I mean, at this point, they didn't even have a name for this disease, and so they really had no way to treat or cure it, at least not yet. Jocelyn felt totally deflated. Even though they had just figured out what was behind the family's deadly illness, there was nothing she could do about it. Over the last 20 years, Jocelyn has come to terms with her diagnosis. Because the risk of passing on her deadly genetic variant was so high, Jocelyn and her husband chose not to have kids. Her older sister Hillary opted to use a form of in vitro fertilization that allowed her to have twins who were both free from the family disease. Right now, in the 6th and newest generation of the Linder family, there are 23 children. But due to advances in fertility treatment, none of these new generation kids have the genetic mutation. The Linders were able to stop the spread of their family illness. Today, there are 7 members of the Linder family who do carry the genetic mutation who are still alive. Dr. Seidman and her team continue to research their illness in hopes of someday finding a cure. In January of 2015, a 27-year-old Texas man named George Pickering III suffered a massive stroke. He was immediately admitted to a hospital where he was put on life support, and then doctors delivered some bad news to his family. It would turn out George was brain dead, and they advised the family that realistically they should consider pulling George off of life support because it wasn't going to do him any good. George's family was totally devastated by this news. In fact, George's father was so upset he just left the hospital altogether. And so in his father's absence, George's mother and brother wound up talking to doctors and saying that yes, we are prepared to pull George off of life support. After they consented to have this done, they put George on an organ donor list and then began making funeral plans. When George's father came back to the hospital later that day and found out his family had consented to have George pulled from life support, he was furious. He did not believe his son was just totally brain dead and there was no hope. He felt like they should at least try to give him a little bit more time to potentially give them a signal that he was okay. But George's mother and brother told George's father that they had spoken to the doctors and there was just no hope. There was no reason to delay this process. It was time. But George's father was totally not having it. He stormed out of the room and he found the doctors and he demanded they keep his son on life support just a little bit longer. But the doctors told him there really is no reason to do that. And in fact, all you're doing is jeopardizing the people that need his organs, that are waiting for this organ transplant. And so really what we need to do is actually expedite taking him off of life support because that's the best thing to do right now. George's father was so upset, totally distraught. He ran back to his son's room. He laid over his son and he just held his hands and stared at him and just prayed that his son would give him some sign that he was actually not brain dead, but his son didn't. And before long, the doctors began filtering into the room to begin the procedure of removing his son from life support. And when they came in the room, George's father kind of snapped. He ran out of the room, he ran out of the hospital, he went out to his car and he got his gun and then ran back into the hospital, back into his son's room and aimed the gun at the doctors and ordered them to stop what they were doing and leave the room immediately. And so the doctors had not actually begun removing George from life support, so he's still on life support. And so once the doctors and everyone left the room, George's father walked over, he locked the door, and then for the next several hours, he just kept his gun aimed at the door as he laid over his his son and just kept looking down in hopes that his son would give him some sign that he was not brain dead. And so finally, when the SWAT team arrived and was stacking up outside the door in the hallway, they began yelling into the room for George's father to put the gun down and let them come in. And George's father the whole time is just looking down at his son, hoping and praying that his son is just going to do something. And right as the SWAT team kicks in the door and comes into the room, George's father had reached down and grabbed his son's hand, and his son squeezed his hand back. And as soon as his father felt that, he dropped the gun and he surrendered peacefully to the SWAT team. And then the SWAT team put George's father on the ground, and as he's being detained, George's father is yelling for the doctors to come in the room. My son is okay. And sure enough, when the doctors came in the room, George was okay. He was moving his hand, his eyes were open, he was making good eye contact, and before long, he made a totally full recovery. He would later be told that had his father not stepped in when he did and bought him those extra few hours on life support, George would have died. As for George's father, he was ultimately sentenced to 10 months in prison for his aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, but he and the rest of his family think what he did was certainly worth going to prison for. In 1959, Ronald McNair was a very gifted 9-year-old African-American boy living in South Carolina. While he was good at virtually everything he tried, from music to athletics to schoolwork, the only thing that ever really grabbed his attention was outer space. And so as a 9-year-old child, he made the decision that one day he was going to become an astronaut. But he had no idea how to become an astronaut. And so he decided the first thing he would do would be to go to his library and take out some books on NASA, the very famous organization that sends American astronauts to space. However, there was an issue with his plan. This library only served white patrons. It was a segregated library. Ronald knew this, but he figured, you know what, I'm a polite kid, I can get in there and get out before anybody notices me. But as soon as he walked into that library, everybody in there, who were all white, just stared at Ronald. Ronald could feel it, but he just kept his head down and he walked through the library. He got to the science section, he grabbed a couple books he wanted, and then he walked back to the counter and he put them up, and he very politely asked the librarian, who was also white, if he could check these books out. And this librarian looks at him and says, "Young man, you better get out of here before I call the police." And Ronald at this point looks up at the librarian and thinks for a second, and then just hops up onto her counter and sits there and says, "Okay, I'll wait for the police." The librarian was totally outraged and would call the police and would call Ronald's mother. And before long, the police did show up, and it was two white guys. They come inside, and this librarian runs over to them, and she's talking to them, and she's pointing back over at Ronald, gesticulating that very clearly Ronald is the issue. That's why you've been called here. And the officers would be just totally annoyed by this librarian, and they would say to her, "Why don't you just let the kid take the books out?" And the librarian was totally offended at this and began defending her decision to call the police instead of letting him take the books out. And as she's defending herself, Ronald's mother comes running into the library. She runs over to her son to make sure he's okay, and then she looks up at the police officers and this librarian to try to figure out what's going on. And at this point, the police officers are just totally over it, and they turn to the librarian and they say, "You know what, you really ought to let him take the books out." And then the officers just turned around and left. The librarian was not about to just let him take the books. She was still very upset, and so she storms over to Ronald's mother and she says to her, "You shouldn't let your son come in here." And at this, Ronald's mother is looking at this librarian who's totally upset, and she looks down at her son who's got his head down, and then she notices the few books on the counter about space, and she was aware of Ronald's love for outer space, and she put together what had happened. And after thinking about it for a moment, she looks up at this librarian and she just says, "Well, since he's here already, can he take out those books? He'll take good care of them." The librarian is still totally furious, but knows this is a losing fight. And so very reluctantly, with a scowl on her face, she grabs the books and she jams them into Ronald's arms. And Ronald's mother nudges Ronald and says, "What do you say?" And Ronald, while holding all of his new books about NASA and space, looks up at the librarian and smiles and says, "Thank you, ma'am." And then he and his mom turn around and they leave. Ronald would go on to earn his PhD in physics from MIT, one of the most prestigious prestigious universities in the world, and after graduation, he was picked up by NASA to become an astronaut. And in 1984, Ronald went into outer space. He was actually the second African American to ever go into outer space. And while he was in orbit, apparently he played his saxophone for his crew. And then in 1986, Ronald was chosen again to go on another mission to outer space, but tragically, 73 seconds after takeoff, their space shuttle, the Challenger, exploded, killing Ronald and the 6 other astronauts on board. Following his death, the library in South Carolina that had tried to turn Ronald away for his skin color renamed themselves the Ronald McNair Life History Center. The United States formally entered World War II in December of 1941 following the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii by the Japanese. Roughly 6 months later, a 21-year-old Alabama native named Henry Irwin joined the Army Reserve. After nearly 2 years of additional military training, Henry was made into a radio operator and was assigned to a B-29 bomber. A B-29 bomber is this huge aircraft whose sole purpose is to drop bombs. And so in February of 1945, Henry and his B-29 bomber unit were sent to the Pacific to do just that, drop bombs on the Japanese. 2 months after arriving, Henry's B-29 was tasked with being the lead bomber in a group attack on a Japanese chemical facility located about 125 miles north of Tokyo. Aside from just operating his radio inside of the B-29, occasionally Henry's job was to organize the other planes in the attack when their B-29 was the lead attacker. And so the way he would do this was by dropping a series of smoke bombs out of his plane, and then once they touched the ground and all the smoke was coming up, he would hop on his radio and communicate with the other pilots in his sortie and tell them to organize themselves off of this visual reference point on the ground. He would basically have them fly to certain positions relative to the smoke cloud. And so once all the pilots had been organized into proper formation, they would continue to their target and commence their bombing raid. For this mission, Henry was in his typical position right behind the front turret gun towards the front of the plane. When his pilot told him to start dropping smoke bombs, Henry did as he was told. And so he pulled the lever, which opened up a chute on the bottom of the plane, and all these smoke bombs began tumbling out of it. Now, as soon as he pulled that lever, all of these smoke bombs that were in that particular chute were ignited. They were on a timed fuse, and so they would tumble out of the plane, and then before hitting the ground, they would ignite, and then smoke would start billowing out of them. But for some reason, after he pulled that lever, a couple of the smoke bombs fell out of the chute, but one of them kind of got turned around, and as it tumbled down, it kind of caught itself on the lip and bounced back up into the plane, and it struck Henry square in the face, shattering his nose, and then it ignited and literally lit Henry's face on fire, which instantly blinded him. Smoke bombs are not considered lethal devices because they do not explode the way typical bombs do. However, make no mistake about it, you would not want to be near a military-grade smoke bomb when it went off. In order for it to emit that very thick and long-lasting smoke that it does, the smoke bomb ignites a chemical fire within itself that burns extremely hot. And so when the smoke bomb came back inside the plane and ignited right in front of Henry, those chemicals landed on his face, and so that's why he caught on fire. And if that wasn't bad enough, the smoke bomb also filled the plane completely with smoke, making it impossible for the pilots to see anything. Despite his burning, shattered face, all Henry could think about was if he didn't get this smoke bomb off the plane in the next few seconds, they were all going to crash and die. So instead of trying to put out his burning face, Henry began feeling around on the ground for the smoke bomb, which again is basically like a fireball, and when he found it, he pulled it into his chest, trying to smother it as best as he could. And while his body completely engulfed in flames, Henry began low-crawling his way towards the front of the plane, where he knew, just by touch, there was going to be a window. And so as he agonizingly crawled, he's on fire, he finally gets to this window, he can feel it above him, and he manages to lift the smoke bomb up and throws it out the window. And then afterwards, he collapses on the ground and he passes out completely on fire, fully expecting to die. A few seconds later, the smoke inside of the plane cleared because now the smoke bomb was gone, and the pilot who had put the plane on autopilot but did have to drop significantly in altitude because they were starting to stall, Bill finally could see again and saw they were about 300 feet from hitting the water. And so he was able to pull back and get them out of their dive, and he narrowly escaped crashing into the water, and he turned around and began flying back to base. On this return trip, the crew, who were unhurt, began assessing the damage, and they saw Henry on fire on the side of the plane, and so they rushed over and they put him out with a fire extinguisher, expecting him to be dead, but to their shock and horror, he was still alive. And so they gave him morphine for his pain and expected him to die any moment, but Henry didn't die. Instead, he was very cheerful on the flight all the way back to base, and he would ask each of his crew members if they were okay, and they would all say, yeah, I'm just fine. It's really you who we're concerned about here. When the pilot finally landed back at base, Henry's body had stiffened up so dramatically from being on fire that the doctors couldn't actually get him out of the plane's side door, and so they had to dismantle the side of the plane to get Henry out. And so the doctors fully expected Henry was going to die basically any moment from his horrible wounds, but since he hadn't yet, they did everything they could to try to save him. They put him through dozens of surgeries, including one where they would try to remove the chemical flecks from the smoke bomb that had embedded in his eyes. And since these chemicals combusted as soon as they made contact with oxygen, every time they pulled out one of these flecks, it would burst into flames and very painfully burn Henry's eyes a little bit more. While Henry was undergoing all these surgeries, the rest of his B-29 crew immediately went to their commanding officer and said, you have to put Henry in for the Medal of Honor. The Medal of Honor is the highest award you can achieve in the US military. After the commanding officer heard the story of what Henry had done, he agreed, and in record time, he got the paperwork processed and got Henry approved for this award. But there were no actual physical medals of honor on the island to actually present to Henry, and the officers and the rest of his crew were worried Henry would die before the actual medal was shipped out to the island to be given to him. And so the only Medal of Honor that was on this island was inside of a museum behind a glass case. And so one of the officers in Henry's crew went into the museum, shattered the case, took the display Medal of Honor, and rushed to Henry's bedside and put it around his neck. And then after that, somehow Henry just didn't die. After dozens and dozens of surgeries, Henry actually regained sight in one of his eyes and regained the use of most of his body. Henry would later be asked in an interview what it was like to do this very heroic thing that he did. And he would say, well, I only moved the bomb 13 feet, but 13 feet feels like 13 miles when you're on fire. Henry would go on to be honorably discharged from the military, and he would spend the next 37 years working closely with other burn victims, trying to keep them positive and optimistic about their recovery. He would also go on to have 4 children, one of which became an Alabama state senator. In 2002, Henry died of natural causes at the age of 80. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comment section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please replace all of the like button's Windex with olive oil. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads.